and welcome to the Christian Record. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. As the title says, we're going to cover a history of the praise and worship album. On one hand, this is going to be a lot, so you want to strap in, grab your popcorn. Why is that? Well, it's kind of a little bit impossible to put everything exactly in order. So we're going to kind of do this by eras or time periods. And for clarification, when I say a praise and worship album, I'm referring to artists who are typically in a different genre, regardless of their body of work, their rock, metal, whatever. They are specifically adding a praise and worship album to their catalog. And stick with me until the end, because I'm going to have a big reveal on this one. And what is a praise and worship album? We kind of clarify that as well here. Generally, that's a collection of songs, whether done live in a worship setting or done in a studio, either one, where they could be or were created for the purpose of leading congregations in worship. So their sole purpose was to either be played in a church, originally, or lead large congregations in worship to God. So that's kind of how I'm looking at artists who may not be in the praise and worship genre. So we'll kind of talk about that here too. But also they're doing a praise and worship album. So anyway, let's get started. So in the beginning, I guess that's kind of how I titled this era. You had artists like the Imperials and Dallas Home, and even Mylon Lefevre had some with Gospel Ship and things like that that made it into churches. So in essence, there were songs that were beginning to be incorporated and played from their just albums. So not necessarily written for that purpose, but because the song maybe had a chorus in it that could be pulled out and then incorporated. That's kind of how some of the churches began to add some of these more contemporary songs to the church services. And so you had a little bit more, Southern gospel being added to church services. And this is just, of course, before the Jesus movement that they're beginning to incorporate these more contemporary songs, which leads us to really the second time period or era, which is the Jesus movement. And bands like Love Song were basically coming in and playing in the churches or in a particular church as far as Love Song's concerned. And so in essence, they were a praise and worship band that ended up being, a band that also put out albums and things like that. So in essence, they didn't necessarily probably think of themselves as a praise and worship band, but because they were facilitating a service, and they basically were part of that movement that was brought into the church, but also was bringing other people into the church as well. And so that music and that culture was all part of that. And so bands like that were basically playing praise and worship style songs during the services. And referring Dallas Home a little bit before, by 1975, Dallas Home was releasing albums with the word praise in the title, and even changed, so to speak, the group name to Dallas Home and Praise. And their album that was Dallas Home and Praise Live, that was 1977, was very popular with churches. And so also if you look at maybe 1977, Keith Green could probably be added to that list, mostly because, not necessarily because he was writing praise and worship songs, so to speak, but more due to the emphasis he had on ministry in the church as opposed to entertainment, which is maybe kind of where we'll look at that dividing line, facilitating worship to God as opposed to just, playing a concert for the people attending. And so he was doing a little bit more ministry oriented. And so some of that kind of filtered this way, and he was even playing, in churches and things like that as part of his ministry. Other artists in moving kind of towards the 80s, second chapter of Acts, Sandy Patty. I remember especially in our church, we incorporated some Sandy Patty stuff that we did. Lorna Harris, Twyla Paris. She kind of, was kind of more CCM, and then maybe even kind of moved into more praise and worship, but definitely her upbringing and beginnings are in church worship facilitation, so probably add her to that list as well. The next distinct era I would probably say would be church choruses. And what I mean by that is I can remember, transitioning from singing strictly hymns to incorporating what we called choruses. And in essence, the chorus was the entire song for some of these. So simplified structures and shortened songs so that they could be learned really quickly, both the melody and the words, and they could be sung over and over and over. And so that was kind of what I look at, especially in our church, which was really conservative, so we kind of were maybe latecomers to it. But incorporating these simple, small choruses that were just kind of repeated over and over, but we were adding them to the hymns, so it's not like we had gotten rid of the hymns yet. And I can kind of remember even like we were almost like you're deciding who is going to the cool church, so to speak, because you'd ask other people, oh, okay, you're going to that church. Do you guys do choruses? And that's kind of how we, were figuring out what they were like as far as their worship services by asking if they were doing choruses yet at their church. And of course, youth groups were quickly incorporating these choruses, at retreats and things like that, because that was really quick to, bring a guitar along, sing those, and do these choruses. So that would be kind of what I would consider the next era. Next, we have what I would call the corporate praise and worship era, and this is the period when modern style praise and worship took its shape. Basically, companies, saw the money that was in there, and they also saw, of course, I'm not want to say it's all about money, but they saw a need in order to provide more of these choruses and praise and worship songs to the churches. And so they basically, a lot of times they were even started in churches. And so they, brought band members together, a lot of times multiple different members. And in fact, when I list these companies, so to speak, you'll understand that almost every album had a different set of musicians that went along with it, because it was less about the musicians and more about putting out new songs that could be sung by the churches. So some of these would have been Maranatha. Their first release was Praise One in 1974, so around that Jesus movement. Vineyard Music in the 80s, and they would actually eventually specifically say that their music was written to be sung to God as opposed to about God, so to speak. And so that was something that they kind of even put in their differentiation of what they thought praise and worship, what it meant to have a praise and worship song, was that it was sung to God, not about God or about God's attributes, kind of a thing. And then Hosanna Praise, which is kind of, I guess, Hosanna Praise / Integrity. Music started in 85, and then, of course, Hillsong 92. And so there started to become this, clear distinction when we start to think about the term praise and worship, and that genre really being fleshed out was really right then at this era where the companies were putting out a slew of new music almost every month. I think Vineyard was doing an album maybe quarterly, something like that, and some of the others were also doing pretty quickly as well. And so definitely a lot of musicians that were taking part in that, and then also a lot of writers were given this new opportunity to write new music, and it was getting out there really quickly. So the next era maybe I would point at would be the praise and worship artist. So in essence, what happened is, a lot of these artists who were part of those companies or corporations became popular. Their particular songs became popular, and so they would put out a independent release of their own songs. So those songs could be found on the corporate albums, and then they could also be on the album of the independent artist. And so you had the popular artists with the popular songs that began to get followings. And so if I kind of list a few of the maybe highlights, obviously, there's so many of them now, but band Cutting Edge in 1992. They later became known as Delirious, but when they first started out as Cutting Edge, that was a praise and worship band. So in essence, while I'm trying to make a point here at the end, they kind of went the other way. So they started out as a praise and worship band and then went more just as a rock band. But a lot of their stuff was played in churches. And so if I move forward to like 95, would have been Charlie Hall. And then it's kind of hard to tell exactly when some of these started because they had like independent releases that didn't necessarily show up, in record stores, stuff like that. And so the year that I give may not be the official year that they started, but looking into the mid to late 80s. So you got Matt Redman in 98, Daryl Evans, Chris Tomlin, Paul Blosch, Passion Worship Band, of course, brought in some of these other people as well because they were doing their conferences every year, and that I think started in 1998. And so definitely by the time you got Passion Worship Band and that popularity and pushing the praise and worship even farther. So on to the next era would be marketability. It became clear pretty quickly, I think, that there was money to be made for those artists who weren't necessarily in the praise and worship genre to dabble in that genre a little bit. And somewhere along the line, it seemed like almost every artist, if they wanted to be noticed and get enough exposure in the Christian music industry, they had to have a Christmas album and they had to have a praise and worship album. And we're going to kind of go through some examples of who I'm talking about here. So maybe some of the artists that you might consider maybe would have a praise and worship album anyway, and so isn't too far off the beaten path. But there was an album, it was kind of a compilation actually, of different artists called Songs from the Loft. That was put out in 1993. Main artists would have been Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, things like that. And then there was a series of praise and worship, I think maybe 3 of them, I can't remember exactly how many, but Ardent Worship, which was live worship, and the one that, actually 2 of them, Satellite Soul, and then also Skillet for their early years. So not necessarily maybe a band at that point that a lot of people knew as well as they're known now, but definitely had that Ardent Worship from Skillet, and that was 2000. Michael W. Smith's album 2001, Worship. Maybe a lot of times people are going to credit that as being the one that brought this all about. But I think as you see as I'm doing this history, that's not necessarily the case. Because even in 2001, Caseman's Call did the first of their In the Company of Angels. Rebecca St. James also Newsboys by 2002. Each of those had large hits with their praise and worship albums, and of course then we're off and running because now we've got all the major names at that point are all putting out praise and worship songs. And in fact, you end up with at that point, because they're all at the same time, you end up with like 12 versions of the same song. And maybe that's why it starts to get a little interesting, and an episode like this starts to occur, because you start, man, it's like everybody's doing the exact same song. Well, obviously it's popular and they wanted to have a praise and worship album because it's marketable, and so everybody's doing the same song. But we kind of get to the point now, as far as the episode, I'm talking about those who you wouldn't necessarily think about in terms of doing a praise and worship album. And so Kutless, It Is Well, I've got that on the list, and pop up a little cover there. Seventh Day Slumber, Take Everything, and there's other ones as well I can certainly find, but those would be just two quick examples of bands that are in the hard rock genre, and they are putting out a praise and worship album. In fact, I think Kutless put out a second one. It wasn't necessarily as evident as the It Is Well, but I do believe they put out a second one. Now, I'm not necessarily complaining, I guess, about the hard rock artists putting out praise and worship music or praise and worship songs in the style that they would typically do. And so, it gives some variety to those praise and worship songs. And I enjoy, obviously, the edgier versions a lot of times anyway. But I still find it interesting, that it came, to their mind to even put out a praise and worship album, since that's not necessarily their genre. I do, however, feel like variety is increasingly getting lost in the Christian music industry in the name of marketability. Suddenly everyone is a praise and worship artist, and they're just popping up everywhere. And now we come to the big reveal. Some of you probably are, if you know anything about the history of music, you're screaming at me at the video, you're typing nasty comments because you feel I left something out that is very important. And I did this on purpose, because there's one album that was released before that era of the corporations were really formed, and definitely before the rise of the so-called popular praise and worship artist. And that would be in 1989. Petra released this album right here. Petra Praise, The Rock Cries Out. And it even had a sequel by 1997, which is, even that is still before some of the praise and worship artists that were rising, because you saw those dates I gave, 1998. So Petra's already got their second one for We Need Jesus, I believe it was that one. And this is clearly ahead of everyone else when you think about a non-praise and worship artist putting out one of these albums. And because, obviously, a rock band, they weren't in praise and worship music. But Petra, as always, was a pioneer in the Christian music industry. And a lot of that at the time, you think in terms of Petra and other Christian rock artists were still at that stage where they weren't necessarily accepted by the churches. But Petra at the time, just a little bit before this album, were touring with Josh McDowell. And of course he was, becoming very popular with the Evidence Demands a Verdict and things like that. So his apologetics that he would talk about. And so they Petra at least began to get more credibility in the churches when they were touring with Josh McDowell. And so they obviously wanted to work with churches and wanted to work with youth leaders. And so they pretty much just point blank asked, what do you guys need? What is it that we can do to help? How can we further this ministry through music? And the kids love the music, but how else can we help you? And the result was The Rock Cries Out. And so definitely a pioneer, and I would say maybe the very first of the non-praise and worship rock bands to put out a praise and worship album. But it wouldn't be until, wow, much later, a decade later, for even some of that to show up with other artists saying, oh, that's a good idea. But anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Kind of how you experienced the move of praise and worship, from bands through your church and things like that. And remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode.